Some viewers may find the following video disturbing. Viewer discretion is advised.
Welcome everyone. Today we're going to be talking about An Ice Cold Mother Part 10. Today we're talking about the life of Shonda Vander Ark. As the police made their way through Shonda Vander Ark's home, they would notice a few things that just stood out as was very, very odd. For starters, they would notice in the bathroom that not only was there a trash can full of zip ties, but there was also a trash can full of used adult diapers. Even more oddly, they would also take notice that there was an ice machine inside the bathroom. They would walk around the kitchen and notice that all the refrigerators and freezers would also have locks on them, which would also strike the police as odd, as if her son had passed away because he was on a hunger strike, why would you lock up the refrigerator and the freezer? And finally, as they were doing an investigation, they would walk by a closet, and one of the police officers would notice that a smell was coming out of this closet, and they would peek inside of it, and they would find this makeshift tarp that was positioned like a bed. And they would also find urine stains and defecation stains that were on the floor as well. And they would also notice that there was also not only video cameras, but also sensory cameras inside this closet. Before the police would even interview Paul or Shonda later, the police had thought it would be best to confiscate a few of the cameras to see what was actually on them. And it's at this point that the police would ask Paul about the hunger strike that Timothy was supposedly on. And in the video, you can actually see Shonda walk up as they're talking to Paul about it. And she would just very casually go, "Oh, Paul, didn't I tell you about the hunger strike that Timothy was on?" And Paul would just shake his head and say, "I had no idea he was on a hunger strike." And he would just bury his face in his hands. After the police would leave, Shonda would begin trying to covering her tracks, trying to erase any kind of proof that what herself and Paul had actually done to Timothy. And it said that she would just take all of her SIM cards and start breaking them up and scattering them across the neighborhood, and would actually start taking down all of the cameras and all of the sensory cameras and everything, just trying to eliminate any kind of incriminating facts. But unbeknownst to Shonda, the police had found more than enough incriminating footage on the cameras that they had confiscated. In fact, one of the cameras that they had confiscated would actually show Shonda dragging Timothy out of the ice bath and screaming at him the night of his death. And it's at this point that they would return back to Shonda Vander Ark's residence, and they would actually place her under arrest, not only for child endangerment and neglect, but also child murder. Later on that night, Paul would actually go live on the app Facebook. And if you're ever able to see this live stream, you can clearly see that Paul is very visibly upset. He goes from talking about his mother being arrested, but he would cut himself off. And he was just really, really obvious that Paul knew more than what was going on. And the police knew that Paul knew more than he was letting on. And it's at this point that the police started trying to retrieve all of the text messages between not only Shonda Vander Ark, but also through Paul. And it's at this point that they would call him in for an interview as well.
Because he didn't get food. He knows that. Maybe he's taking food because he wants to live. Have you ever thought about that? Yes. Maybe he's stealing food so that he can survive. I do know that my mother, she's not perfect, but she's not a bad person. It's not just that. We loved him. That he's down because he couldn't eat food. Does that feel like love to you? No. He's because he couldn't eat. She starved him to. She's asking me to do all these things that are literally her brother. I know she's not perfect. How is that love? How is love? How is love ice baths? How is love? How is love handcuffing? And how is love restricting movement? And how is love hot sauce in the mouth and only eating bread? What if you only got to eat bread? How would you feel? What if you only got to eat bread with hot sauce? Would you eat? No. You're pretty skinny already. It wouldn't take you long. This is my natural weight. I have an overactive metabolism. You're punishing me by giving him ice baths and hot sauce and only feeding him bread. How is that? How is that a loving person? How is that a loving mother? You know what that sounds like to me? And honestly, the worst mother I've ever met in my entire life is what it sounds like to me. I know. But she doesn't.
After this interview, they would actually place Paul under arrest for child murder of his younger brother Timothy. And it's at this point that the police started building the case not only against Shonda but also Paul. But surprisingly, Paul would actually agree to testify against his mother. And with Paul testifying against Shonda and the video footage that they had of Shonda and the large amounts of text messages that was extremely incriminating against Shonda, they began building a case. And while waiting for trial, Shonda would actually have a complete heyday with the police. And she would make various complaints while in prison and would tell the police that she couldn't be in prison because of the fact that she had a low blood sugar and she had a service dog that actually alerted her about her sugar. She would also have the audacity to tell the police that she had a sensory processing problem and was suffering with PTSD from her husband's stroke, and would actually have the audacity to say that the loud noises in the prison would actually trigger her, which is really kind of messed up considering that she did not show her son any kind of sympathy when he actually shared the same exact issue. It's also said that while building the case that Paul would start becoming more forthcoming about all the things that went on leading up to Timothy's death, and this would actually help the police out a lot more. By December of 2023, the trial for Shonda Vander Ark would actually begin. And by this time, the entire world was completely outraged by Shonda Vander Ark, because at this point, this case had actually gone completely viral. It was all over not only Facebook and YouTube and television, it was even all over TikTok. And people were tuning in every single day to hear this case. Shonda would actually have the audacity to say that Timothy's death was an accident, and would say that she was not guilty of murdering her own son. There's actually a point in the trial that the lawyers would actually start questioning Shonda about her quote-unquote accidental death of her son, and would start throwing all these different pictures of Timothy, where Shonda would actually cover her mouth and you can actually hear her fake trying to throw up. From the beginning to the very, very end, she was never really honest about anything, and she was just trying to get any kind of sympathy from the courts. And at this point, the judge and the jury and the lawyers were not having any of it. They would even bring in the coroner and give a testimony of Timothy's autopsy of his death, and they would say that not only was he killed by hypothermia, but he was actually starved to death. And they would even go in detail that he was so starved that the ligaments in his bones were starting to detach from each other, and it is exactly that is how bad his health had gotten. And the coroner would actually explain to the courts that his body was just slowly shutting down. They would even bring in Shonda's now ex-husband, Adam Vander Ark, and his testimony would reveal some very questionable things.